Hello, students. Lesson 3 of Topic 6 looks at the Dust Bowl. In the mid-1930s, while the United States was in its worst economic recession, just to add insult to injury, we also went through one of our worst ecological disasters. And the creation of the Dust Bowl is an interesting example of how both physical and human geography can contribute to this ecological disaster, as well as how physical and human geography can affect one another. To begin with, the central and southern Great Plains were a difficult area to farm. This is what we would call marginal farmland, really right on the very edge of what would be considered desert. And indeed, until fairly recently, that area was referred to as the Great American Desert. The physical geography of this area is what contributes to the difficulties. It rarely gets rainfall above 20 inches, which is the minimum necessary for an American farm in the 1930s at least. In addition, that's the Great Plains region, so there's not a lot of trees or anything to block the wind, and the wind is very, very powerful. So the region itself was marginal at best, and there had been cultures prior to white settlement that had farmed in the area through intensive irrigation techniques, but many of them eventually did succumb to drought, much like America would in the 1930s. Farmers in this area will use a much more intense version of agriculture in order to be able to raise crops in the area. One thing was much larger farms. The Homestead Act of 1909 extended upon the earlier Homestead Act. In fact, it doubled the amount of acreage that would be given away from 160 to 320 acres, which is going to encourage more settlers into the area. And new farm equipment, like the one seen here, this disc plow that's being drawn by a tractor, was able to cut up the sod and pulverize the topsoil of the Great Plains area and allow them to farm a larger and larger area. So much more of the area was now coming under this intensive agriculture because you couldn't produce as much per acre as you could in more fertile areas, so you had to farm larger areas. Previously, a lot of the economic activity of this region was grazing of cattle and other livestock. So as cattle and livestock get pushed onto smaller and smaller grazing areas as these larger farms come into play, they start to overgraze the grasses that were there because they're unable to range farther and eat from a wider variety of areas. The farmers are plowing up the grasses and the sod with the more intensive farming techniques, and this sod is of the utmost importance on the Great Plains. If you recall, Americans weren't able to farm there for a long time until the steel plow became widely available because of how thick this sod was. The root system was very deep and intertwined. And this served to hold the soil in place against those powerful Great Plains winds. And with all of the plowing up of the area, that left the topsoil vulnerable to those drought-like conditions. So in the mid-1930s, the southern and central Great Plains get hit with a massive drought. And top that off with the fact that you don't have a root system holding the soil in place, and you get these massive, massive dust storms that characterized the Dust Bowl. You can see them in this picture here. These things were massive. Some of them were as tall as 8,000 feet high and moved at a speed of about 100 miles an hour. And you had to get inside when these came through. They could literally choke people to death. Cattle and birds and even fish suffocated from all of the dust in the air and what settled in the streams and in the water there. And this dust, it blows the topsoil out of the Great Plains and across the country. Much of it gets blown all the way out to the East Coast, clear on the other end of the continent. There are photographs and there's even film from an American naval vessel taken by sailors coming into New York Harbor, and the Statue of Liberty is almost obscured by all this dust. It looks like smoke. It looks like the city is on fire, but it's actually dust from the Great Plains that has been blown all the way across the country. They estimated that the amount of topsoil lost from the Dust Bowl was equal to twice as much of all the dirt that was removed in the building of the Panama Canal. Humans altered the physical geography to create the Dust Bowl, and the Dust Bowl's ecological disaster altered the human geography of the region. Hundreds of thousands of Dust Bowl refugees, referred to as Okies, because some of them came from Oklahoma, although they came from all over the region, migrated away because they could no longer survive in that area. They could no longer farm the region. Many of them went to California. Famously, John Steinbeck's book, The Grapes of Wrath, follows an Okie family on its trip to California, looking for farm work there. But there already was a group of farm laborers in Southern California, particularly Mexican and Asian Americans who worked a lot of those farms, Filipino and Japanese Americans. And these largely white Okies are now competing with the Asian and Mexican Americans for this farm work. And there's going to be a big push on their part to what they call repatriate at least the Mexican American farm workers. Repatriate means to forcibly deport them. And there will be quite a few Mexican Americans, many of whom were U.S. citizens, who will either be forced out or pressured into moving out of the country from the competition with the Okies. Others will move into cities, as we had seen before, looking for work or joining the military. And we see a big population shift. There's a lot of movement of people during the 1930s, and we saw that with sharecroppers losing their land, or farmers being unable to meet their mortgages in the Midwest. The Okies of the Great Plains are another group that will migrate to the big cities looking for work. But much like the other ones, they find that there is not a lot of work to be had because, of course, this is the Great Plains. But we'll see states with large cities see their populations increase significantly during the 1930s, while the Great Plains states see a drop of about 2.5 million people who moved away from it. Land ownership in the Great Plains will change, and we saw something similar in the Midwest, but even more so on the Great Plains, where larger scale farmers who were better able to weather the hard times of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl are going to buy up the smaller farms from these Okies and buy them at rock bottom prices and consolidate them into much, much larger farms. Something more akin to what we would see today in that region. Was very, very large farms, and a lot of them were actually corporate farms or company farms. They were owned by a corporation. Many of them are owned by an agribusiness today, not by individual farmers. The family farm in this region starts to disappear in a large part. After the Dust Bowl, we'll see a concerted effort by the federal government to irrigate this region. So there will be dam building and irrigation projects. And in fact, in the next lesson, we'll look at the New Deal, where the federal government set up a bunch of programs to hire American workers and get people back to work. One of those is going to be to irrigate the southern and central Great Plains region. However, for most of the Okies and the small-scale farmers who went out looking for land of their own under the 1909 Homestead Act, it was far too late. So this irrigation projects that currently allows them to grow in that area really will benefit the larger farmers who are able to remain. When we look at the graphic organizer here for this section, this lesson, the top part of it are all things that caused the Dust Bowl. The middle represents the Dust Bowl itself, and the bottom part then are things that are affected by the Dust Bowl. So for each of those, you want to describe, for example, the physical geographic features, rain and wind that led to the Dust Bowl, as well as the human geographic features. Homestead Act, the farming methods used, and the grazing of livestock. And then at the bottom, you want to tell me, how was livestock affected by this? How was the topsoil affected by the Dust Bowl, the Okies, and how did what happened to the Okies lead to changes for Great Plains states and states with big cities, and so forth. So as an example, we'll look at the very first one here in physical geography. Rainfall, how does that aspect of physical geography lead to the Dust Bowl? The southern Great Plains rarely got the 20 inches of rain that was needed for farming, right? And then just do the same for the others listed there. All right. Te amo, ciao.